Hi guys, let's talk about where regular folks slept in England back in the Middle Ages, say around the 1300s or 1400s. It wasn't like today. Most people didn't have separate rooms just for sleeping. Instead, almost everything happened in one main room. This was the main space in their house. The house was usually pretty small and not fancy at all. Many houses were built using a method called half-timbering. That means the frame was made of wood beams you could see, and the spaces in between were filled with a mix of woven sticks and mud or clay, which they called wattle and daub. The roof was often covered in thatch. Thatch is just dried reeds or straw bundled together tightly. It was common stuff. Houses like this were everywhere, in little villages scattered across the countryside. Places maybe a day's walk from something big like Stonehenge, though people then probably just thought of those stones as some old rocks. Not a big deal. You'd find them inside old walled towns too, like within the walls of York or London, squeezed close together. This one main room was where life happened during the day. People cooked their meals over a fire in a fireplace built into the wall, called a hearth. The hearth was important because it gave heat and light. They ate their food in this room. They fixed their tools, or maybe did some weaving here. Kids played on the floor if it wasn't too crowded. Animals might sometimes be brought inside if it was very cold, especially in smaller farmhouses. It was a busy place when the sun was up. When it got dark, which happened early, especially in winter, things changed. Without good lights, maybe just a dim rushlight, a reed soaked in fat, or the glow from the hearth's embers, doing much was hard. So people went to sleep. And guess what? They slept right there in that same main room where they did everything else. Everyone slept together in this space. The whole family. That meant mom and dad, all the kids, maybe a grandma or grandpa if they lived there, and sometimes even a servant or a farm worker if the family had one. Privacy, like having your own bedroom, wasn't something most people thought about or could afford. They all just bedded down together on the floor of the living space. It was normal. Imagine a family of 6 or 8 people, maybe more, all settling down for the night in one room that also smelled a bit like the dinner they cooked and the smoke from the fire. The air could get pretty thick, especially since chimneys weren't always great at letting all the smoke out. The walls might be damp sometimes because of the English weather, which is often rainy. So where did they actually sleep? Well, it wasn't usually on a raised bed with a mattress like we know it. Those cost money and took up space. For most regular people, the floor was the sleeping spot. But they didn't just lie down on the hard, packed earth or stone floor directly. That would be cold and uncomfortable. Instead, they spread out a layer of straw or dried rushes all over the floor where they slept. Rushes are like tough grasses that grow near water. Sometimes, if they were doing a bit better, they might have a rough cloth sack or a big bag stuffed with straw or dry leaves. This sack was their mattress. People called this kind of bedding a straw pallet, or just the straw. After the harvest time, the straw might be newer and fresher. Other times, especially later in the winter, it might be old, broken down, and kind of dusty or crumbly. They didn't change it super often. They'd just sweep out the worst of it and add new straw on top sometimes, or replace a big bunch when it got too lumpy or smelly. That was about as comfortable as sleeping got for most folks in that one room. Nobody expected fancy beds. The fire in the hearth would slowly die down to just glowing embers as the night went on. The room would get colder. It would get very dark, except for maybe the faintest red glow from the hearth or the tiny flickering light of a rushlight if someone had bothered to light one, which they often didn't to save the fat. Everyone would huddle down on their bit of the straw. They might pull rough wool blankets over themselves, or just use their outer clothes or cloaks as covers. People back then wore more layers of simple wool clothes day and night anyway. Then, they would try to sleep until the morning light came through the small, often unglazed windows, covered maybe with oiled cloth or a wooden shutter, or until something woke them up. A baby crying, someone snoring, the cold, animals outside, or needing to use the outdoor toilet area, which was just a pit or a ditch somewhere away from the house. It wasn't complicated. One room, one space for cooking, eating, working, and sleeping. One shared pile of straw on the floor. That was the normal, everyday setup for a huge number of people living in England during those centuries. Whether you lived in a tiny hamlet near the old stones of Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain, or in a cramped lane within sight of the huge York Minster Cathedral, or along the Thames near London Bridge, if you were an ordinary person, this single-room living and sleeping was likely your reality. The big churches or castles were places you saw, maybe even worked on, but they weren't where you slept. You slept on the straw on the floor in your one room. When morning came, you got up, stirred the fire, and started the day right there again. It was simple, crowded, and just how things were done back then. People didn't know anything different, so they didn't complain much about it. It was normal life. The sounds of the night were the sounds of your family breathing. Maybe the wind whistling through gaps in the wattle and daub, or an animal outside, and the crackle of the dying fire. Then morning came, and it was time to get up and work. Usually starting by getting the fire going again in the same hearth right there in the same room where everyone had just been sleeping. The straw might be kicked aside a bit or left there until later. There wasn't a big routine of making beds like today. You just got up and started the day. The room switched from sleeping space back to living space pretty quickly. The smell of smoke and maybe cooking would replace the quiet smells of the night. It was all the same place. That's how it was for most folks sleeping in medieval England. Not much changed day to day. It was just life in that one room, on the straw. Simple, crowded, normal. Nothing exciting to report, really. Just people trying to rest in the space they had, using what they had, which wasn't much beyond the basics. The big famous places like the Tower of London or Canterbury Cathedral were far away from the daily reality of sleeping on a straw pallet in a smoky, single-room house in a village or a crowded town street. Those landmarks existed, but they didn't change how ordinary people slept. They slept on the floor, together, in the main room. That's the main point. Day in, day out, for generations. The straw got replaced sometimes. The people grew up and had kids who also slept on the straw. The thatch roof needed fixing now and then. The wattle and daub might need patching after heavy English rain. But the way of sleeping, in that one room together, stayed pretty much the same for a long, long time. It was just the way it was done. Nothing fancy. Nothing complicated. Just sleep where you live, with everyone else. End of story for how most people slept in medieval England. At least that's the first part about where they slept. It wasn't special. It was normal life back then. The room was small. The air was smoky sometimes. The straw got old, but it was home, and it was where they slept. Every night, in England, during the Middle Ages, in houses made of wood and mud and straw, under thatch roofs, near places we now think of as important, but which were just part of the landscape to them, like Stonehenge, or the big walls around York, or the river in London, just places, while they slept on straw on the floor in their one room. That's it. That's how it was for sleeping for most people. Simple and straightforward, no extra frills, just the basics. Sleep, get up, work, sleep again, in the same space, with everyone, on the straw, night after night, year after year, in medieval England. Okay, that covers the place. It was just the main room. One room for everything, including sleep, for almost everyone who wasn't rich, which was most people. So most people slept like this, on the floor, on straw, together, in England. Back then, the end of this part. Morning would come, and they'd start over. But that's not part of the sleeping part. That's later. For now, they were asleep, on the straw, in the room, together, in medieval England. That's the first thing about how they slept. Where? It was the main room. Let's move on from where people slept to what they actually slept on back in medieval England, especially around places like London or Canterbury. For most regular folks, the fancy beds you might picture weren't really part of their lives. Forget mattresses stuffed with feathers or springs. What people used was much simpler and, honestly, pretty basic. Think about that main room we talked about last time. The floor was often just packed earth. Maybe some stone if you were in a slightly better house in a town like York near the old walls, or near the Thames in London. Lying straight on that hard surface all night. Not comfortable, not warm. So people put down a layer of stuff. The most common thing was straw. Dry straw, spread out in a thickish layer in the corner or along the wall where the family slept. Sometimes it was dried rushes, which are like tough grasses you find near rivers, maybe even gathered down by the Fleet Ditch in London before it got really bad. This stuff was cheap and available, especially after the harvest. Farmers had plenty. They called this bedding a pallet, or just the straw. It wasn't fancy. After a while, the straw would get broken down, dusty, and probably itchy. It might start to smell, especially if the room was damp from the English rain, or if small critters found it cozy. People didn't change it every day. Maybe they'd sweep out the worst bits sometimes and throw down some fresh straw on top, or replace a big chunk of it when it got too gross or lumpy. Comfort wasn't the main goal. It was about having something between you and the cold, hard floor. For slightly better off families, maybe a craftsman living near the shambles in York, or a shopkeeper on a London lane, they might have a rough sack made of cheap cloth, like hemp or coarse linen. They'd stuff this sack with straw, dried leaves, or maybe even dried ferns or moss gathered from the woods. This was a step up from just loose straw on the floor. It was called a straw tick, or a mattress, but it was still pretty lumpy and scratchy. You'd toss this stuffed sack onto the straw layer, or sometimes onto a simple wooden frame if they had one. A basic platform off the ground, maybe just a foot high. This kept you a tiny bit further from drafts and dirt on the floor. But mostly, it was still straw inside. Wool was a big deal in England back then. Sheep were everywhere, so sometimes if a family had a bit more, they might have a thin mattress stuffed with wool clippings or waste wool. This was definitely softer and warmer than straw, but it was still nothing like a modern mattress. It could get lumpy and compacted over time. Even these wool mattresses weren't super common for average folks. Straw was king. What did they cover up with? Blankets were usually made of wool, too. Rough, scratchy wool blankets. They weren't thick and fluffy like we have now. They were woven simply and were pretty heavy and stiff, especially when they got damp in the humid English air. Sometimes people just used their heavy outer cloaks or extra layers of their regular wool clothing as covers. Rich folks had fur covers or finer woolen blankets, maybe even linen sheets. But for the person living in a small house near Canterbury Cathedral or walking past the Tower of London every day, thick, scratchy wool was the nighttime standard. Pillows? Mostly not a thing. Seriously. The idea of a soft pillow for your head wasn't universal. Many people, especially the less well-off, just bundled up a piece of their clothing, like a tunic or a cloak, and used that to rest their head on. Maybe they had a small sack stuffed with straw or husks. Real pillows stuffed with feathers or down were a luxury item, mostly for the wealthy or perhaps seen by common folks inside the grand churches, like Westminster Abbey during services, but not in their own homes at night. You made do with what you had, which often meant resting your head on your arm or a rolled-up piece of cloth. So picture it. In a dim, smoky room in a half-timbered house somewhere in England, maybe hearing the bells from St. Paul's in London or smelling the River Ouse in York, a family settles down for the night. They lie down on a crackling layer of old straw, or maybe on a scratchy sack filled with more straw. They pull rough, heavy wool blankets over themselves. Their heads rest on a folded tunic. The air might be chilly and damp. The straw rustles. It might itch. It wasn't soft. It wasn't what we'd call comfortable, but it was what most people had. It was their bed. Night after night, year after year. The straw got replaced eventually. The blankets wore thin, but the basics stayed pretty much the same. Straw for padding, wool for warmth, the floor or a simple platform, and whatever was handy for your head. That was sleeping comfort for the average person in medieval England. No frills, just the simplest way to get off the cold ground and try to get some rest before another long day of work in the fields, or a shop, or down by the docks on the Thames. It was functional, not fancy. And that's pretty much all there was to it for a huge number of people living back then. The big castles and cathedrals stood tall, but inside the small homes, sleep happened on scratchy, simple bedding made from whatever was cheap and available locally. Straw from the fields, wool from the sheep, simple cloth. That was the recipe for a medieval English bed for the common man, woman, and child. Nothing exciting to report, really. Just the way it was. They didn't know any different, so they didn't complain much. It was just part of life, sleeping on scratchy straw under scratchy wool, in a room that smelled like smoke and damp earth somewhere in England during those centuries. Okay, that covers what they slept on. Next time, maybe where the slightly richer folks slept. But for now, that's the straw and wool reality for most. the end of this part about bedding. Let's talk about what they actually wore when they slept back in medieval England, say around the 1300s or 1400s. The simple answer is that most regular folks didn't really have special clothes just for sleeping. Not like pajamas or nightgowns we might think of today. For the average person living in a small village near a place like Canterbury Cathedral or in a crowded lane not far from the old London Wall, nighttime clothing was usually just their daytime clothing, maybe with some adjustments. It was a practical thing. People back then wore layers of simple clothes made mostly from wool. Wool was everywhere because England had a lot of sheep. It was the main fabric. Linen was used too, especially for the layer right next to the skin, like an undershirt. But wool was king for warmth, even when it got damp from the frequent English rain or fog rolling in off the Thames or the Ouse in York. A man might typically wear a long shirt called a tunic, some simple trousers or leggings made from wool or rough cloth, and perhaps a heavier woolen cloak or outer coat for colder days. Women wore long dresses or tunics, often with an overdress on top, and maybe a head covering like a wimple or a simple kerchief to keep their hair tidy and their head a bit warmer. When it was time to sleep in that one main room everyone shared, people wouldn't usually get completely undressed. There were a few reasons for this. First, it was often cold, especially in winter. The fire in the hearth would die down to embers, and drafts came through the gaps in the wattle and daub walls, under the door, or through the oiled cloth covering window holes. Places like the Cotswolds or up near York could get pretty chilly at night. Second, getting undressed completely wasn't always practical or considered necessary. Privacy was very limited, with everyone sleeping together in the same room. Parents, kids, maybe grandparents or a servant. Changing clothes fully just wasn't something done much at night. Third, it was faster and easier. So what most people did was take off their outer layers. They might remove their shoes, if they had any beyond simple leather wraps or wooden pattens for muddy streets. They might take off their belt, and perhaps their heavy outer wool tunic or overdress. But the basic underlayer, like the long shirt or smock, usually stayed on. This long shirt, often made of linen or coarse wool, was essentially their underwear and also their base layer for sleeping. It wasn't special sleepwear. It was just the clothes they had on under everything else. Sometimes, if it wasn't too cold, maybe on a rare warm summer night down near the coast in Sussex or Kent, they might take off their outer wool tunic or dress and just sleep in that long undershirt or smock. But very often, especially in the colder months, which were most of the year in England, they would sleep in most of their day clothes. They might pull their wool cloak over themselves like an extra blanket, or use a rough sackcloth covering. The main idea was to stay warm enough to sleep, not to be comfortable in fancy sleep clothes. Comfort wasn't really the big goal. Survival, avoiding freezing, and getting some basic rest were the priorities. So you'd see folks bedding down on their straw pallet, wearing their wool leggings and their tunic, or their wool dress, maybe loosened a bit at the neck or waist, but still very much on. Their head covering, like the kerchief or coif, might stay on too, for extra warmth on their head and ears in the drafty room. Even their stockings or hose might stay on their feet. For little kids, it was much the same. They wore smaller versions of adult clothes, simple tunics or smocks made from whatever fabric was available, often hand-me-downs or rough homespun wool. They usually slept in these clothes too. Babies might be swaddled tightly in long linen strips, which was a common practice people thought helped them grow straight and kept them warm and secure, preventing them from startling themselves awake. Then the swaddled baby would be placed near their mother on the straw for warmth and feeding during the night. Now, for the folks who were a bit better off, maybe a merchant living near the Guildhall in London, or a minor landowner in a village within sight of York Minster or the walls of Chester, things might be slightly different. They might afford a separate sleeping space, even if it was just a corner curtained off in a larger room. They might have access to finer, softer linen for their undergarments. They might have a specific, looser shirt or a simple gown made of linen that they wore only for sleeping. But even for these slightly richer people, it wasn't usually a radically different outfit bought just for bed. It was often just a cleaner, perhaps longer or less worn-out version of their basic undertunic. Not something you'd find in a special store called sleepwear. They still relied on layers and heavy wool blankets for warmth. The very wealthy, like lords living in castles like Windsor or Warwick, or bishops in palaces near cathedrals like Lincoln or Durham, definitely had proper nightshirts and maybe even robes, often made from finer linen or even imported silk. These might be seen by servants or glimpsed during rare visits, but that world of silk nightwear was completely separate from the reality of the common person living near the Thames docks in Southwark or farming near Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain. Their scratchy wool was the nighttime standard. A big reason for sleeping in day clothes was simple practicality. Getting fully dressed in the dark, cold morning, especially in a single room with only the faintest gray light coming through an oiled cloth window or a crack in the shutters, was difficult and time-consuming. Candles or rushlights cost money. If you were already wearing most of your clothes, your smock, your tunic, your leggings, you could just get up, pull on your outer tunic or dress over it, fasten your belt, slip on your shoes or pattens, and start your day much quicker. This was important when your day started before dawn. Also, clothes weren't washed very often. Water had to be hauled, heated over the fire, and washing took time and effort. Wool, especially the thick outer layers, wasn't easy to clean frequently and could shrink or felt. Linen undershirts might be washed more, but still not daily. So wearing them day and night wasn't seen as particularly strange or overly dirty by the standards of the time. Lice and fleas were common facts of life for everyone, rich or poor. Sleeping in fine feather beds in castles like the Tower of London, or on straw in a hut near Runnymede, partly because of the infrequent washing of bodies and clothes. The scratchiness of the wool was just part of life. So picture a family settling down for the night in their half-timbered house somewhere in England. The bells from the local parish church, maybe Saint Mary Le Bow in London, or a smaller, simpler church in a village near Hadrian's Wall, have rung for curfew, signaling it's time to be indoors. The room is dark, except for the faint red glow from the hearth's embers. They kick off their rough leather shoes, or set aside their wooden pattens near the door. Dad takes off his belt and his heavy outer wool tunic, folding it roughly or just dropping it nearby. He sleeps in his woolen leggings and his long linen shirt. Mom might loosen the laces or ties on her wool dress, but keeps it on over her smock, perhaps keeping her head kerchief tied for warmth. The older kids curl up in their smaller tunics and leggings. The younger ones might just be in their smocks. They pull the scratchy, heavy wool blankets over themselves. No one changes into special, soft pajamas. The clothes they worked in the fields near Glastonbury Tor, or sold goods in a stall near London Bridge, or mended nets by the coast, are the same clothes they sleep in. It was just simpler, warmer, saved time, and was more practical given the lack of privacy and the cold. And that was pretty much it for sleepwear for most people across England during those centuries. Nothing fancy, nothing special. Just the same basic layers they wore during the day, slightly adjusted for lying down. It got the job done. They didn't lie awake wishing for cotton pajamas. They just slept in what they had on. If they woke up cold in the middle of the night, shivering in the damp air common near places like the Fens or the Lake District, they'd pull the rough blanket tighter or huddle closer to a family member or the dying warmth of the hearth. The wool clothes provided some barrier against the chill, even if they were scratchy and smelled of wood smoke and daily toil. Morning would come, gray light slowly filtering through the oiled cloth covering the window hole, and they'd stand up, pull on their outer tunic or dress over the slept-in underlayer, fasten their belt, slip on their shoes, and the clothes they slept in became the clothes they worked in again. Day in, day out. The linen smock or shirt might get changed eventually, when it was deemed necessary, or perhaps on a Sunday before church near a place like Salisbury Cathedral. But the wool layers? They were worn and slept in repeatedly, week after week. It was just how things were done. No big deal. No special routines or fancy garments. Sleep, get up, work, sleep again, mostly in the same clothes. Simple, practical. Not too comfortable by modern standards, but completely normal and unremarkable for the time in England. The big churches stood tall, casting shadows. The castles loomed on hills over towns. But inside the countless small homes, people slept in their work clothes. That's the unexciting reality for sleepwear back then. Nothing too complicated about it. Just people using what they had, day and night. Okay, that covers what they wore to bed. Or rather, what they didn't change out of for bed. End of this part about nighttime clothes. Let's talk about where the richer folks slept back in medieval England. This means people like lords living in castles, well-off merchants in towns like London or York, maybe some higher-up church people near places like Canterbury Cathedral or Westminster Abbey. Their sleeping situation was definitely different from the common folks in their one smoky room. It wasn't all super fancy like in movies, but it was a step up. First off, these people usually had a separate room just for sleeping. It wasn't always huge, but it was their own space, away from the main hall or the kitchen. In a big stone castle, like Windsor Castle or Warwick Castle, the lord and lady might have a private chamber, often called a solar. This room was usually up high in a tower or off the main hall, maybe overlooking the castle courtyard or the Thames River if it was near water. It offered some quiet and privacy. In a townhouse belonging to a successful merchant near the Guildhall in London or the Shambles in York, The master and mistress of the house would likely have their own bedchamber on an upper floor, away from the shop or the servants below. Even hearing the bells from St. Paul's or York Minster felt a bit different when you were in your own room. Inside this room, the main thing was the bed. It wasn't a mattress on the floor. It was a proper wooden bed frame. These frames were often big and heavy, made from strong English oak. They were raised quite high off the floor, sometimes needing steps to get into them. This kept them away from drafts and dirt. The frame held ropes stretched tightly across it, forming a sort of base. On top of these ropes, they placed a mattress. But this mattress wasn't stuffed with straw like the common folks used. It was stuffed with softer things. Goose or duck feathers were the best, making it soft and warm. Sometimes they used wool, but a much finer, cleaner wool than the scratchy blankets others used. This feather bed was a big sign of being rich. Around this bed, there were often curtains, heavy cloth hangings, maybe made of wool or even velvet for the very rich, hung from the bed frame or from a special frame around the bed, called a canopy. These curtains could be pulled shut all the way around the bed. This did a few things. First, it kept out drafts, which was important in cold stone castles or drafty townhouses, especially during damp English winters near places like the Fens or the Lake District. Second, it gave privacy, especially if servants came into the room. Third, it kept out insects, though bugs were still a problem everywhere. The curtains might have fancy patterns or even pictures woven into them. Closing yourself into this little cloth room at night was pretty much the height of comfort back then. The bedding itself was also better. Instead of rough wool blankets, they had sheets made of linen. Linen was smoother and felt nicer against the skin than scratchy wool. Then, on top of the sheets, they had blankets, but again, finer wool ones, maybe even woven in places like the Cotswolds known for good wool. And then, for extra warmth or show, they might have a coverlet. This could be a brightly colored woven blanket, or even one stuffed with feathers, like a big quilt. Pillows were a thing here too. They weren't sacks of straw. They were stuffed with feathers, soft and comfortable for your head. They might have pillowcases made of linen too. The room itself might have a few other things. Maybe a chest for storing clothes and valuables, often locked. Perhaps a small table and a stool. There might be a fireplace to keep the room warm, which was a huge luxury. A fireplace meant you didn't have to rely on the main hall fire downstairs. A servant would come in to tend it. Windows might have shutters to keep out the cold and dark, and sometimes even panes of glass, which was incredibly expensive and rare. Mostly, it was just shutters or maybe oiled cloth. If you were a bishop living near Durham Cathedral, you might have slightly nicer glass. Rushes or straw were still sometimes strewn on the floor, but it was cleaner straw, changed more often, and maybe even sprinkled with herbs to smell nicer. But it was still straw on the floor. Life wasn't perfectly quiet, though. Even in a private chamber in the Tower of London, you might hear guards changing watch, horses in the courtyard, or the general noise of the city or castle outside. But it was definitely quieter than sleeping in the main hall with dozens of people. Getting ready for bed might involve a servant bringing warm water to wash your face and hands. You might change into a special nightshirt, a long linen garment, instead of sleeping in your day clothes. This was another sign of wealth. having clothes just for sleeping. The lord or lady would climb into the high bed. The curtains might be drawn shut by a servant, and a candle or small oil lamp might be left burning low for a little while, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls or timbered ceiling before being blown out. Waking up was different too. A servant might come in to open the shutters, rebuild the fire, and bring warm water again. You'd get dressed in your proper clothes for the day, maybe with help. It was a slower, more private start than jumping up from the straw and getting straight to work. For a rich merchant in Bristol looking out over the River Avon, or a lord waking up in his castle near Hadrian's Wall, this separate room with its big curtained bed was pretty much the best sleep you could get. It wasn't perfect by today's ideas, still drafty, still potentially buggy, still smelling a bit of smoke and rushes, but compared to sleeping on straw in the main room, it was a world apart. It showed your status. Having your own sleeping space, a big soft bed with curtains, and fine linen sheets was what being wealthy meant for sleep in medieval England. It wasn't for everyone, just the people with money or power. Everyone else made do with the floor or a simple straw tick in the common room. But for those who could afford it, this was the way. A quiet room, a high bed, curtains drawn. That was comfortable sleeping back then. Okay. That covers where the better off people slept. So, people in medieval England went to sleep when it got dark. Mostly. But the night wasn't always just one long stretch of sleep until morning, like we often think of it today. Especially for regular folks sleeping in that one main room, the night could be broken up. It wasn't necessarily a solid 8 hours of quiet rest. First off, it was really dark. Like really dark. There wasn't street lighting outside your little half-timbered house in a village near Stonehenge or down some lane in London. Inside, after the hearth fire died down to embers, the only light might be from a small, dim rushlight, basically a reed soaked in animal fat. Or maybe a tallow candle if the family could afford it, which many couldn't. These gave off a weak, flickering light and lots of smoke. They weren't left burning all night. They were expensive and a fire risk in houses made of wood, wattle, and daub with thatch roofs. So mostly people slept in near total darkness, especially away from the faint glow of the hearth. The only sounds might be the wind whistling through gaps in the walls near Hadrian's Wall, or the occasional animal noise outside, or the bells from a distant church like St. Paul's in London tolling the hours if you were close enough to hear them. People woke up during the night for various reasons. One common reason was simply needing to use the toilet. Most houses didn't have indoor plumbing. Instead, people used a chamber pot kept in the corner of the room. It was just a simple pot. Using it in the dark, with everyone else sleeping nearby, was just part of life. The smell could get noticeable, especially towards morning. In towns like York, near the Ouse River, or London near the Fleet Ditch, the general smell outside wasn't great anyway, so an indoor pot wasn't the biggest issue. Someone would have to empty it outside in the morning, often into a communal ditch or cesspit. Not pleasant, but normal. Another reason to wake up was the cold. Especially in winter, the embers in the hearth might not give off enough heat. Drafts were common. Someone, often an adult, might need to get up to add more wood or peat to the fire to stop everyone from freezing. This meant stumbling around in the dark or by the faintest light, trying not to step on sleeping children or the family dog that might be curled up near the warmth. The damp English chill, seeping in from places like the fens or the moors, could be bone deep. Sometimes people woke up because they just woke up. Lying on a scratchy straw pallet under rough wool blankets wasn't always super comfortable. Maybe someone snored. Maybe a baby cried and needed feeding. Maybe you heard rats scurrying in the thatch above you, a common problem everywhere. From peasant cottages near Canterbury Cathedral to slightly better houses in Bristol. Maybe the straw was itchy. Or maybe the noises of the city at night filtered in. The watch calling the hour near the London Wall, distant arguments, or animals moving in the street. In castles like the Tower of London, you might hear the changing of the guards or distant noises from the River Thames. There was also this idea that some people slept in two chunks. They might go to sleep soon after dark, sleep for a few hours, then wake up for an hour or so in the middle of the night. This watch period, as some called it, wasn't necessarily planned. People might lie awake quietly, talk softly with their spouse if they were awake, maybe pray, check on the children, have a simple snack like bread, or even do a quiet chore like mending by the faint firelight if they had a rushlight burning. Then, after this period of being awake, they would go back to sleep for the second half of the night until dawn. This wasn't everyone all the time, but it seems to have been a pattern for some people, especially before artificial lighting made long, unbroken nights more common. It was just a natural way the night sometimes unfolded. For the very religious, there were set prayers during the night. Monks in monasteries like Westminster Abbey would get up for services like matins in the middle of the night. Ordinary people living near such places might hear the bells calling the monks to prayer, but they usually didn't get up for formal prayers themselves unless they were particularly devout. More commonly, if someone woke up feeling scared or anxious, maybe from a bad dream or the howl of a wolf, rarer by the late Middle Ages, but still possible in remote areas, or just the general uncertainty of life, they might say a prayer quietly to themselves before trying to go back to sleep. Dawn came early in summer, late in winter. People generally got up with the light. There wasn't much point trying to do things in the dark. The first person up, often the woman of the house, would stir the embers in the hearth, add fuel, and get the fire going again. The smell of smoke would start to fill the room, replacing the quieter, colder smells of the night. The chamber pot would be taken out and emptied. The straw on the floor might be kicked aside or swept roughly. The room, which had been a sleeping space, quickly became the living and working space again. People put on their outer clothes over the layers they slept in, ate a simple breakfast, and started the day's work. The night was over. It hadn't been a silent, undisturbed movie sleep. It had been a practical, sometimes interrupted period of rest in a dark, often cold or uncomfortable environment, punctuated by the basic needs and noises of life in medieval England. Whether you were near the ancient stones of Avebury or hearing the bells of York Minster, the night brought its own rhythm, different from the day, but not always the deep, unbroken sleep we imagine. It was just how nights were back then. People accepted the interruptions and the darkness as normal parts of life. Okay. That covers how the night passed for sleeping folks back then. So, people back in medieval England didn't just sleep. They had some thoughts about it, and especially about dreams. It wasn't like today where we might just shrug off a weird dream. For them, sleep and dreams could mean something more, tied into their beliefs about the world, God, and the things they couldn't see. Most folks, whether living near the old stones of Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain, or in a cramped house hearing the bells of St. Paul's in London, believed sleep was necessary. It was when your body rested and got its strength back after a long day working in the fields near Canterbury, or hauling goods by the Thames docks. Without sleep, you couldn't work properly the next day. That was pretty much the basic, practical view. Going without sleep too long made you weak and fuzzy-headed, and everyone knew that from experience. But dreams were a different story. Many people thought dreams weren't just random nonsense. They could be messages. Sometimes, people believed dreams came from God. A dream might be a warning about something bad that was going to happen, like sickness or a poor harvest. Or it could be a sign telling you to do something. Maybe go on a pilgrimage to a place like Canterbury Cathedral or give money to the church. Churchmen often talked about important dreams in the Bible, like Joseph's dreams, so the idea that God could speak through dreams was pretty common. If you had a really strong or scary dream, you might even go talk to your local priest about it near your parish church. Whether it was a grand one like York Minster or a small village church. On the other hand, people also worried that bad dreams could come from the devil or evil spirits. A nightmare wasn't just a bad dream. Some folks thought it was literally a mare, an evil spirit, sitting on your chest while you slept, making it hard to breathe and giving you frightening visions. People living near places associated with old stories, like the wild moors around Dartmoor or the deep forests near Sherwood, might be especially likely to think about spirits causing bad dreams. To protect themselves, some might say prayers before bed, or hang special herbs near where they slept, like over the straw pallet in the main room or near the curtained bed in a merchant's house in Bristol. There were also ideas about dreams predicting the future or revealing hidden truths. A dream about finding money might make someone hopeful about their luck turning around. A dream about a relative who had died might be seen as that person visiting from the afterlife, maybe giving advice or asking for prayers. This kind of thinking wasn't approved of by the church all the time, but it was pretty common among regular people trying to make sense of things. You might hear folks chatting about their dreams down by the River Ouse in York, or while waiting to sell goods at a market near London Bridge. People also paid attention to how they slept, sometimes. Sleeping on your right side was often thought to be better than sleeping on your left. Some old ideas, passed down from even earlier times, linked different sleeping positions to different moods or health. Doctors back then, who believed in things like bodily humors, might think too much sleep made you sluggish and cold, while not enough sleep made you hot and irritable. But for the average person sleeping on straw near Hadrian's Wall or in a Cotswold village, it was more about whether you felt rested or not, rather than complex medical theories. For most ordinary people, though, the main thing about sleep was still just the practical need to rest. Whether you were a fisherman sleeping in a hut near the coast, hearing the sea, or a blacksmith in Warwick near the castle snoring after a long day, you needed sleep to function. The thoughts about dreams and meanings were there, floating around, maybe discussed on a slow Sunday afternoon or after a strange night. But the daily reality was simpler. You worked hard. You got tired when the sun went down, helped along by the curfew bell in towns. You slept as best you could on whatever you had, and you got up to work again when it got light. The deep thoughts about God or spirits sending dreams were probably more for when a dream was really unusual or scary. Most nights, sleep was just sleep. A dark, quiet period to recover in their small, smoky homes scattered across England, from the damp fens to the rolling downs. It was a break from the hard work, and that was important enough on its own, without always looking for hidden messages. But the idea that dreams could mean something was always there in the background, part of how they saw the world. Okay. That covers some of what they thought about sleeping and dreaming. Children in medieval England slept pretty much like everyone else, just smaller. There wasn't a big fuss about special kid beds or routines. It was practical, fitting into the crowded single-room life most people had near places like Canterbury Cathedral or the bustling lanes of London. Babies were often swaddled. This meant they were wrapped tightly from shoulders to feet in long strips of linen cloth. People thought this helped the baby grow straight and kept them warm and secure. A swaddled baby couldn't move much. They were usually placed near their mother on the straw pallet, or sometimes in a simple wooden cradle if the family had one. The cradle might be pushed near the hearth for a bit of extra warmth during cold nights, especially in drafty houses near places like the damp fens or up north by Hadrian's Wall. The mother would feed the baby during the night as needed, right there in the main room. The smell of smoke and damp wool was just the normal air. Toddlers and little kids slept close to their parents or older siblings. They didn't have their own little beds. They just found a spot on the shared straw pallet on the floor. If the family had a simple raised bed, the younger children might sleep there with the parents, all crammed together. Privacy wasn't a thing. Everyone slept in the same space, hearing each other breathe, snore, or stir. A child might curl up near a slightly warmer spot, maybe closer to the dying embers of the hearth, or next to an older brother. Their clothes were simple versions of adult wear, wool tunics or smocks, and they usually slept in them, just like their parents did. Comfort wasn't the goal. Staying warm and out of the way was. If they woke up scared from a bad dream, maybe hearing owls near Sherwood Forest or the distant bells of York Minster, they might just whimper quietly or shuffle closer to a parent. There wasn't usually a lamp left on. It was dark, and they learned to cope. Older kids, the ones helping with chores or even apprentices living with a master craftsman near the Shambles in York or a shop in Southwark across the Thames from London, slept where space allowed. In their own home, they still shared the main room floor or a corner of the family bed. If they were servants or apprentices in another household, they slept where the master told them to. This could be on straw in a corner of the workshop, on the floor near the kitchen hearth, or even in a loft space if the building had one. It was functional sleeping, not comfortable. They used whatever blanket was spare, which might not be much. Sharing body heat was common. Getting enough sleep could be hard if they had early chores, like fetching water from the Thames or feeding animals before dawn near a place like Runnymede. Bedtime wasn't a strict ritual. When the adults decided it was time, often after the evening meal and as the light faded completely, everyone settled down. There weren't special bedtime stories like today. Maybe a parent would tell a familiar tale or sing a simple lullaby. But mostly, kids just got tired from the day's work or play and fell asleep when it got quiet and dark. The rhythm was set by daylight and the needs of the household. If the parents were mending clothes by the faint light of a rushlight, the kids might fall asleep to the sound of their voices talking about the day's events or worries about the harvest near Salisbury Plain. Sleeping through the night wasn't guaranteed for kids either. They got cold. The straw itched. They might wet the straw or their shared bedding. They could be woken by a younger sibling crying, a parent getting up to tend the fire, or use the chamber pot, or noises from outside. Animals, the night watch calling in towns like London near the old wall, or the wind howling through the thatch on a cottage near Dartmoor. If they shared the space with animals brought in for warmth in winter, that added more smells and sounds. They learned to sleep through a lot, or just lie quietly awake in the dark until they drifted off again. There wasn't entertainment or comfort offered in the middle of the night. As children grew older, their sleeping arrangements changed slowly, if at all. A teenager might get a slightly better spot on the straw, maybe near the wall instead of the drafty door. If the family was doing a little better, perhaps a farmer with good land near the Cotswolds, or a shopkeeper in Bristol, an older child might even get a simple straw tick mattress of their own, but still placed on the floor in the common room. Only in very wealthy households, like those of merchants near the Guildhall or minor nobles visiting Westminster Abbey, would children have separate sleeping spaces or small beds with proper bedding. For the vast majority, childhood sleep meant sharing the crowded, often uncomfortable main living space with the whole family, night after night, year after year. It was simply how things were done. They didn't know anything different. They slept where they were put, in the clothes they wore, waking and sleeping to the rhythms of the household and the dark English night. Whether in a smoky hut near Stonehenge or a slightly larger house hearing the bells of Canterbury. It was unremarkable, just part of growing up. There wasn't a concept of a special children's bedtime. Sleep happened when the day ended and the room got dark and quiet enough. That was it. Okay? That covers how kids slept. Over time, the way people slept in England started changing, very slowly. This wasn't like flipping a switch. It took ages, creeping along over many years, even centuries, shifting bit by bit from how things were in the earlier Middle Ages. It wasn't dramatic, just a gradual drift towards something a little different by the time you get closer to, say, the 1500s or 1600s. Think of it like the Thames slowly changing its course over a very long time, not overnight. One of the biggest slow shifts was in the houses themselves, especially for folks who weren't dirt poor. More people, particularly in towns like London or Bristol, or successful farmers out in the countryside near places like the Cotswolds or East Anglia began building houses with more than one room. Instead of just the single big hall where everything happened, you started seeing houses with separate spaces. This meant that sleeping could sometimes move out of the main living and cooking area. A family might have a small chamber, maybe upstairs or off to the side, just for sleeping. It wasn't always fancy, maybe just a partitioned corner or a loft space reached by a ladder. But it offered a bit more privacy than everyone sleeping together next to the hearth where the cooking smells and smoke lingered. Waking up near York Minster, you might still hear the city, but you weren't necessarily sharing your straw with the chickens anymore. The main room was still busy, but the sleepers were a bit apart. Along with more rooms came changes to the buildings themselves. Fireplaces with proper chimneys became more common, slowly replacing the old open hearths in the middle of the floor. This meant smoke could go up and out more efficiently. Sleeping in a room with a chimney meant less smoky air, which was probably a bit better for breathing, even if the room was still often chilly. Drafts were still a problem in houses made of wattle and daub near damp areas like the fens, but the air quality improved a tiny bit. Windows also saw slow improvements. While glass was still expensive, shutters became better fitted, and occasionally, small panes of glass might appear in the homes of wealthier merchants near the Guildhall in London, or prosperous wool traders in Salisbury, letting in a little light while keeping out more cold than just oiled cloth could. What people slept on also saw some minor evolution, though straw remained king for most. For families doing a bit better, simple wooden bed frames became slightly more common, even if they were just low platforms. This got people a few inches off the dirt or stone floor, away from some drafts and dampness. The straw pallet or tick mattress might be placed on this frame instead of directly on the ground. Feather mattresses, once only for the very rich like those living near Windsor Castle, started to trickle down a little further. A well-off yeoman farmer or a skilled craftsman in Norwich might save up for one, seeing it as a mark of comfort and status, though it was still a big investment. Wool blankets remained standard, but maybe a bit finer or thicker if the family could afford it. The idea of dedicated sleepwear also started to inch forward, but only for those with extra resources. While most people still slept in their day clothes or underclothes, the slightly wealthier might own a specific long linen shirt or a simple nightgown used only for sleeping. This was still far from common, but the concept of changing into something different for bed began to exist beyond just the nobility and their castles like Warwick. It was a small step toward separating sleep from the rest of the daily grind. Even the rhythm of the night might have shifted slightly for some. As more houses had better ways to light interiors cheaply, like slightly better candles, and perhaps a bit more security in growing towns or enclosed farmsteads, the old pattern of sleeping in two chunks with a wakeful period in the middle might have become less universal for some people. People might still wake up for practical reasons. A crying baby near Canterbury Cathedral, needing the chamber pot, adding fuel to the fire on a cold night near Hadrian's Wall. But the idea of a planned, quiet watching period in the middle of the night might have faded a bit for those who could afford to burn a light or felt safer. The strict tolling of the curfew bell in cities like London still dictated when respectable folks should be indoors, but the hours inside might have become a little more flexible for some. However, it's crucial to remember that these changes were incredibly slow and uneven. For a vast number of people, especially the rural poor, laborers in cities like York near the Ouse, or miners in the Peak District, life and sleep remained much as it had been centuries before. They still lived and slept in one or two cramped rooms. They still used straw pallets on the floor. They still slept in their day clothes for warmth. They still dealt with cold, drafts, insects, and interruptions. The grand cathedrals like St. Paul's might be rebuilt in new styles, but the sleep of the common person nearby changed far less dramatically. Progress was glacial and mostly benefited those already better off. So by the time you get towards the end of what we loosely call the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, sleeping in England wasn't completely stuck in the past. There were small movements towards more privacy, slightly better bedding for some, cleaner air indoors, and perhaps a tiny bit more comfort. But it was a crawl, not a leap. The basics: finding a spot, getting warm, trying to rest in a world without electric lights or central heating, remained the core experience for the majority, night after night, year after year, whether they were falling asleep to the sound of the Thames or the wind over the Salisbury Plain. The changes were real, but they were subtle and took a very long time to make even a minor difference for most folks trying to get some shut-eye. It was just the slow turn of daily life. Okay, that covers the slow changes over time. End of the final part. Hi guys. The story of wine begins in what is now Georgia and Armenia, where people first started making wine about 8,000 years ago. In Georgia, the earliest evidence comes from places like Shulaveri, where archaeologists found special clay pots called kvivri buried in the ground. These pots, shaped like large eggs, were used to make and store wine. The traditional method involved crushing grapes in stone basins and letting the juice ferment in these kvivri. Today, in Georgia's Kakheti region, particularly around towns like Signagi and Telavi, winemakers still use these ancient techniques. The Alaverdi Monastery, one of Georgia's oldest, has been making wine using kvivri for centuries and continues this practice today. In Armenia, the Arini 1 cave complex contains the world's oldest known winery, dating back about 6,100 years. The cave had a clay fermentation vat, grape seeds, and storage jars. Nearby, the village of Areni still produces wine from local grapes, and visitors can see the ancient wine-making equipment at the Areni Wine Factory. The Noravank Monastery, located close to Areni, is another important site where wine has been made for religious purposes since medieval times. Winemaking spread from these areas to Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians in cities like Ur began producing wine around 3000 BC. The ruins of Ur contain evidence of wine storage and drinking vessels. The famous ziggurat of Ur, a massive temple structure, may have been associated with wine offerings to the gods. In ancient Egypt, wine was made in the Nile Delta region, particularly in areas like the Fayoum Oasis. Tomb paintings in places like the Valley of the Kings show scenes of grape harvesting and wine production. The Egyptians stored wine in distinctive amphorae, many of which have been found in tombs, including those in the pyramids at Giza. The Phoenicians, living in cities like Byblos and Tyre along the Mediterranean coast, became important wine traders. They built special storage facilities for wine and developed ports for shipping it to other regions. The ruins of these ancient cities still contain evidence of their wine trade. The Phoenicians spread winemaking to their colonies, including Carthage and modern Tunisia, where archaeologists have found large wine production facilities. On the island of Crete, the Minoans built elaborate palaces like Knossos that included special rooms for storing wine in large jars called pithoi. The palace ruins contain frescoes showing wine-related scenes, such as harvest festivals. Wine was also important in Mycenaean Greece, where palaces like Pylos had records of wine production and distribution. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, the main entrance to the ancient city, may have been associated with ceremonial wine offerings. As Greek civilization developed, wine became central to their culture. The Temple of Dionysus in Athens was dedicated to the god of wine, and the nearby ancient agora contained shops where wine was sold. Greek colonists brought winemaking to southern Italy, building facilities in places like Paestum, where the well-preserved temples stand near ancient vineyards. The Greeks also established wine production on islands like Thasos, where the ancient wine press can still be seen today. The Romans later expanded wine production throughout their empire, building large facilities in places like Pompeii, where the ruins of wine shops and taverns are preserved. The Villa of the Mysteries, just outside Pompeii, contains frescoes showing wine-related rituals. In Rome itself, the Monte Testaccio, an artificial hill made of broken wine amphorae, shows the scale of ancient Roman wine consumption. Roman wine presses and storage rooms can be seen at archaeological sites across Europe, from France to Germany to Spain. Winemaking continued through the Middle Ages, with monasteries like Cluny in France and Eberbach in Germany maintaining vineyards and producing wine for religious and medicinal purposes. Many of these monastic winemaking facilities still exist today, such as the historic wine cellar at Eberbach Abbey. Medieval castles often had their own vineyards, like those at the Château de Guédelon in France, where traditional winemaking methods are still demonstrated. During the Renaissance, wealthy families in Italy built elaborate wine cellars in their villas, such as those at the Villa Medicea di Cafaggiolo in Tuscany. The famous wine-producing regions of Chianti and Montepulciano developed during this period, with many of the same vineyards still in operation today. In France, royal estates like Fontainebleau had extensive vineyards, and the palace cellars stored wine for the court. The age of exploration saw winemaking spread to new parts of the world. Spanish missionaries planted vineyards in Mexico at missions like Santo Domingo de Guzman, using techniques brought from Europe. Jesuit missionaries established vineyards in Argentina and Chile, with some of these early winemaking sites still operating today, like the Jesuit estancia in Corolla, Argentina. In North America, early settlers planted vineyards in places like Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson attempted wine production at Monticello. The Spanish established missions with vineyards in California, including Mission San Gabriel Arcangel, which still maintains its historic winemaking tradition. Later, Immigrants from Europe brought their winemaking knowledge to regions like New York's Finger Lakes and Ohio's Lake Erie Islands, where some of the original wineries still operate today. The Industrial Revolution brought changes to wine production, with new technologies like mechanical presses and glass bottles becoming common. Many historic wineries from this period still exist, such as the Bodegas Tradición in Jerez, Spain, which continues traditional sherry-making methods. The development of railroads allowed wine to be transported more easily, leading to the growth of wine regions along railway lines, like those in southern France. In the modern era, wine production has become a global industry, with traditional methods being preserved alongside new technologies. Historic wine regions like Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Tuscany maintain their centuries-old vineyards and wineries, while new regions in countries like Australia, South Africa, and the United States have developed their own winemaking traditions. Many old wineries now operate as museums, such as the Chateau Mouton Rothschild Wine Museum in France, where visitors can learn about the history of wine production. After the Greeks had their fun, the Romans decided to take wine production and turn it into an industrial operation. Around Rome and Pompeii, they built these large wine factories with rows of clay pots called dolia buried in the ground. You can still see them at places like Villa Regina in Bosco Reale. The Romans were all about efficiency, using screw presses to get every last drop from the grapes, which they wrote about in farming manuals that basically said the same things over and over about grape varieties like Aminean and Nomentan. The Romans were the first real wine snobs, going crazy for fancy vintages like Falernian wine from near Naples that they'd age for decades. Down at the port of Ostia, they had massive warehouses stuffed with wine jars ready for shipping across the empire. There's this artificial hill in Rome called Monte Testaccio, made entirely of broken wine jars, about 50 million of them, which tells you they really liked their wine. Wherever Roman soldiers set up camp, vineyards would pop up soon after, which is how places like Germany's Mosel Valley got started in the wine game. Rich Romans drank their wine from fancy silver cups at dinner parties they called convivia, while regular folks went to wine bars called popinae, that were basically ancient versions of dive bars. You can still see some of these in Pompeii with their marble counters and built-in storage jars. They had this big temple of Bacchus near the Circus Maximus, where they'd pray to the wine god, probably asking him to cure their hangovers. Roman doctors like Galen prescribed wine for everything from stomach aches to sadness, though their medicine sometimes included weird stuff like lead, which probably didn't help much. Down in Spain, the Romans turned places like modern Andalusia into major wine factories. The area around Cadiz was pumping out so much wine they could barely keep up with demand from Rome. Meanwhile, in France, locals started using wooden barrels instead of clay jars, which was a big deal for shipping wine. Even up in Hungary, Roman soldiers planted vineyards that would eventually become famous wine regions. When the Roman Empire started falling apart, you'd think the wine business would dry up too, but the Catholic Church stepped in to keep things going. Monasteries like Monte Cassino in Italy and Cluny in France became the keepers of winemaking knowledge, carefully writing down all those Roman techniques. These monks were basically the original wine nerds, paying attention to soil types and grape varieties way before it was cool. They kept using Roman tricks for irrigation and hillside vineyards, especially in steep places like Germany's Mosel Valley, where growing grapes on slopes was the only option. The Romans left their mark all over the wine world. There are mosaics at Villa Romana del Casale in Sicily showing grape harvests that look pretty much like harvests today. Museums across Europe have displays of Roman wine tools that aren't too different from what we use now. They set up the whole system we still use, classifying wines by where they're from, aging them properly, even dealing with fake wines. Some things never change. Their shipping routes along rivers like the Rhone and Rhine became the original wine highways, moving product from vineyard to table centuries before trucks existed. So when you're drinking wine today, you're basically tasting history. Those Romans took winemaking from small-time stuff to big business, spreading vineyards further than anyone thought possible. From fancy dinner parties to corner wine bars, they created a wine culture that's still around today. Not bad for a bunch of guys in togas who've been gone for 1,500 years. The way we grow grapes and make wine still follows a lot of their basic ideas, even if we've got better tools now. Their influence stuck around through all those years when wine was mostly made in monasteries, right up until modern times when wine became popular everywhere again. The more things change, the more they stay the same, especially when it comes to wine. After the Roman Empire faded, wine production in Europe fell mostly to monasteries during what we call the Middle Ages. In France's Burgundy region, monks at places like Clos de Vougeot spent years figuring out which patches of dirt grew the best Pinot Noir grapes. Their big stone winery from the 1100s still stands today, looking like a castle but for making wine instead of fighting wars. These monks kept detailed records of their vineyards that would make any modern accountant nod in approval. Down in Bordeaux, things got interesting when Eleanor of Aquitaine married the English king in 1152. Suddenly, the English couldn't get enough of that claret wine, and ships were hauling barrels across the channel non-stop. The Bordeaux merchants got so rich they built fancy buildings around what's now called the Water Mirror Square, where you can see reflections of all that old wine money. Meanwhile, in Portugal, monks at Alcobaça Monastery were aging their wines in cellars with vaulted ceilings that look like they're straight out of a history book. Germany's Mosel River Valley became prime real estate for Riesling grapes during this time. The steep slopes forced winemakers to build stone terraces that look like giant staircases to this day. Hauling grapes up and down those things must have been brutal work. The church ran the show here too, with places like Eberbach Abbey keeping strict records and using wine presses that look like torture devices now displayed in museums. Over in Italy, the Tuscany region started pumping out those straw-wrapped Chianti bottles everyone pictures when they think of Italian wine. Florentine merchants created the first quality control system in 1716, basically an old-timey version of today's wine regulations. Venice became the Mediterranean's wine trading capital, with merchants sipping local Veneto wines in bars along the canals that haven't changed much in 500 years. People drank wine differently back then compared to now. Instead of fancy glasses, they used wooden cups, animal horns, or just passed around a shared bowl. not exactly hygienic by today's standards. Rich folks might have metal goblets, but your average person made do with clay mugs. Doctors prescribed specific wines for different health problems, claiming certain types could cure everything from the plague to bad moods, which we now know is nonsense. The Catholic Church controlled most wine production during these centuries, using it for communion and running what amounted to Europe's largest wine distribution network. Pope Clement V even moved the church headquarters to Avignon, partly to be closer to the Rhone Valley vineyards, the original Holy Relocation package. Over in Hungary, they discovered how to make sweet Tokaji Azu wine from moldy grapes, which became a hit with royalty across Europe. When the Renaissance rolled around, wine started getting fancier. The Medici family in Florence threw parties with actual wine fountains, while Burgundy's dukes hoarded the best vintages for themselves. The big game changer came in the 1600s, with glass bottles that could be corked, finally allowing wine to be aged properly instead of drunk fresh like juice. This led to the start of wine collecting as we know it today. Wine production methods didn't change too much during these centuries. They still crushed grapes by foot in stone troughs and pressed them with wooden contraptions turned by hand. Storage improved slightly with better barrels, but the basic process remained the same from Roman times until the industrial age. The main difference was that monks and merchants kept better records of what worked where, slowly figuring out which grapes grew best in which locations. Trade routes expanded during this period, with wine being shipped farther than ever before. River systems like the Rhine became liquid highways for wine barrels, while sea trade brought Mediterranean wines to Northern Europe. Taxes and tariffs on wine became major sources of income for cities and kingdoms, with toll stations set up along major transport routes. Some of these old wine toll buildings still stand along rivers in Germany and France. The whole system moved slowly toward what we'd recognize as modern wine culture. Regions became known for specific styles, quality levels started being formalized, and the idea of vintages, good years versus bad years, became more established. By the time Columbus sailed to America, Europe's wine traditions were deeply entrenched, ready to be exported to new worlds. The stage was set for wine to go global, but that's a story for next time. For now, just remember that every time you see a wine bottle today, it's carrying centuries of monastic record-keeping, merchant trading, and royal indulgence in its DNA. The expansion of wine production to the Americas followed predictable patterns. Spanish missionaries brought grapevines to Mexico in the 1500s, establishing the first vineyards near Parras to make sacramental wine. The Mission San Lorenzo became an early center of winemaking, using basic methods similar to those in Spain. Buildings from this period show simple adobe construction with open fermentation areas and shaded storage spaces. The tradition continues today at Casa Madero, which calls itself the oldest winery in the Americas, though the original mission buildings are long gone. California's wine story began with Spanish missions along El Camino Real. Father Junipero Serra planted vineyards at each mission from San Diego to Sonoma, using a grape variety now called mission grape. The buildings followed standard mission architecture, whitewashed adobe walls, red tile roofs, and central courtyards. Some original mission wineries remain, like the one at San Gabriel Mission near Los Angeles, though most were replaced long ago. When Gold Rush settlers arrived, they preferred European grape varieties and established commercial wineries like Buena Vista in Sonoma, which still has its 1857 stone winery building. South America's wine industry developed around colonial settlements. In Argentina, Jesuit priests planted vineyards in Mendoza in the 1500s, using irrigation channels called acequias that still exist today. The traditional bodegas featured thick adobe walls and shady patios for fermentation. Some old wineries like Bodega La Rural in Maipú preserved these original buildings as museums. Chile's wine history centers around the Central Valley, where colonial haciendas like San José de Apalta combined wine production with other agriculture. Their long, low buildings with clay tile roofs followed Spanish designs adapted to local conditions. North America's eastern colonies struggled with native grape varieties until successful European vines were established. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson attempted winemaking at Monticello using European methods, though he faced constant failures. The original brick outbuildings where he experimented still stand. Pennsylvania's early German settlers had better luck, establishing wineries like Pennsbury Manor that used native grapes. Their stone cellars and spring houses provided cool storage, following traditions from the Rhine Valley. The 1800s brought industrial-scale winemaking to America. In Ohio's Lake Erie region, commercial wineries like Lon's Winery on Middle Base Island used local Catawba grapes. Their buildings featured limestone construction and underground cellars for temperature control. Missouri's German immigrants established vineyards along the Missouri River, with stone cellars like those at Stonehill Winery in Herman that remain tourist attractions today. These Midwestern wineries shipped large quantities of wine by steamboat until Prohibition. California's wine industry grew rapidly after statehood. Italian immigrants like the Sparborough family built wineries in the Napa Valley using local stone and wood. The original Francis Ford Coppola Winery in Sonoma preserves this early 20th century architecture. Greek immigrants established the Santa Clara Valley wine region, with wineries like Paul Masson using California Mission Revival-style buildings. The University of California at Berkeley established a viticulture program that helped standardize practices across the state. South Africa's wine history began at the Cape of Good Hope in 1659. The Dutch East India Company planted vineyards to supply ships using Cape Dutch architecture, whitewashed gabled buildings that remain iconic today. Groot Constantia, established in 1685, preserves these original buildings as a museum. The traditional Cape style combined Dutch, German, and French influences in both winemaking and architecture. Slave labor built many early wineries, with original slave quarters still visible at some historic estates. Australia's wine industry started with British colonization in 1788. The MacArthur family established Camden Park near Sydney, using Georgian-style buildings adapted to the climate. German settlers in the Barossa Valley built wineries like Seppeltsfield in the 1850s, featuring Germanic architecture with Australian adaptations. Their underground cellars and above-ground stone buildings remain in use. The Hunter Valley's early wineries like Wyndham Estate used simple timber and iron constructions suited to the hot climate. New Zealand's wine history is more recent, beginning in earnest in the 1970s. Early wineries like Mission Estate in Hawke's Bay adapted existing fruit processing buildings. The traditional New Zealand shed style of winery construction, simple, functional buildings, remains common, though some larger wineries now use more elaborate designs. Marlborough's first commercial winery, Montana Brancott Estate, preserves its original 1970s buildings alongside modern EW. The modern era of winemaking brought standardization to the industry. In California's Napa Valley, wineries adopted similar designs featuring tasting rooms with long wooden bars and outdoor patio areas. Places like Robert Mondavi Winery established the template. Mission-style architecture with red tile roofs, courtyard fountains, and rows of oak barrels on display. Visitors follow predictable tour routes through fermentation rooms and barrel caves before ending in the retail area. Most wineries along Highway 29 offer nearly identical experiences, differing mainly in the wines poured and logo merchandise sold. European wine regions maintained their traditional appearances while modernizing operations. Bordeaux's Grand Chateau like Margaux and Lafite Rothschild kept their 18th century facades while installing stainless steel tanks indoors. The cellars remain lined with identical oak barrels, replaced on regular schedules. Tours follow set scripts discussing terroir and aging processes before concluding with samples in nearly identical tasting rooms. Small family wineries in Burgundy preserved their stone fermentation buildings while adding modern temperature controls, creating hybrid facilities that look old outside but function with new technology inside. Australia's wine industry developed characteristic styles seen throughout the Barossa Valley. Large producers like Penfolds use functional metal buildings alongside historic stone structures. The typical visitor center features corrugated iron roofs, broad verandas, and displays of antique harvesting equipment. Tours emphasize the region's German immigrant heritage before offering samples in nearly identical tasting areas. Even smaller wineries follow this pattern, differing mainly in scale rather than layout or presentation. South America's wine regions adopted similar modernization patterns. In Argentina's Mendoza province, wineries like Catena Zapata combined Spanish colonial architecture with state-of-the-art facilities. The typical bodega features adobe-style walls enclosing temperature-controlled fermentation halls. Visitor experiences follow predictable sequences: vineyard tours explaining high-altitude growing conditions, walks through barrel rooms, and tastings at long wooden bars. Most include token displays of traditional concrete fermentation vats, now used only for show. South Africa's wine country around Stellenbosch preserved Cape Dutch architecture while updating production methods. Whitewashed gabled buildings house modern tasting rooms where visitors sample wines in settings that mimic 18th century decor. The standard tour includes historical anecdotes about early settlers before transitioning to contemporary winemaking practices. Even new constructions like Delaire Graff Estate incorporate traditional design elements to maintain regional character while using current technology. New Zealand's Marlborough region developed its own version of standardized wine tourism. Nearly all wineries feature simple timber and glass structures with views of the vineyards. Tastings occur at long counters where staff explain Sauvignon Blanc characteristics using identical terminology. A few historic sites like Mission Estate maintain older buildings, but most opt for functional modern designs that prioritize efficiency over charm. The region's success with Sauvignon Blanc created remarkable uniformity in both production methods and visitor experiences. Wine education became standardized through global certification programs. Courses cover identical material whether taught in Napa, Bordeaux, or Adelaide. Students learn the same tasting techniques, use the same vocabulary, and study the same regions. Examinations test knowledge of standardized quality indicators and production methods. This formalized education created remarkable consistency in how wine professionals worldwide describe and evaluate wines, regardless of origin. The global wine market operates through identical distribution channels. Importers, distributors, and retailers follow the same business models in every major market. Wine shops organize inventory by country then region, using nearly identical display methods. Restaurants construct wine lists following universal formats, sparkling wines first, then whites, reds, and desserts. Even wine storage units for collectors adhere to industry-standard temperature and humidity settings regardless of location. Modern winemaking equipment looks and functions the same worldwide. Stainless steel tanks from the same manufacturers appear in facilities across continents. Presses, pumps, and bottling lines operate identically, whether in Chile, France, or Australia. Laboratory equipment for analyzing wine chemistry comes from a handful of global suppliers. This technological uniformity ensures production methods vary little between regions, contributing to the increasing similarity of wines from different areas. Climate change has prompted nearly identical responses across wine regions. Growers worldwide plant similar drought-resistant rootstocks and install comparable irrigation systems. Harvest dates have moved earlier by comparable margins in California, Australia, and Europe. Research stations share findings that lead to parallel adaptations in vineyard management. The challenges manifest similarly regardless of location, as do the attempted solutions promoted by industry groups. Future developments suggest continued convergence. Emerging regions like China's Ningxia province replicate established models rather than innovating new approaches. Winery architecture increasingly follows global rather than local styles. Even consumer preferences trend toward uniform international tastes. The wine world appears destined to become more standardized, with regional distinctions continuing to diminish over time. What began as diverse traditional practices has evolved toward universal methods and experiences. The business side of wine operates with remarkable consistency across regions. In California's Napa Valley, wineries follow similar pricing strategies based on production costs and brand reputation. Tasting rooms along Highway 29 charge comparable fees for wine flights, typically between $20 and $50. Staff at different wineries give nearly identical explanations about the tasting process, using standard phrases to describe wine characteristics. Retail areas display bottles in similar arrangements, with less expensive wines on lower shelves and premium selections at eye level or in special cases. Most wineries offer memberships with comparable benefits: discounted purchases, exclusive releases, and invitations to special events. French wine regions maintain traditional business practices with modern adaptations. In Bordeaux, the en primeur system continues unchanged for decades, with buyers sampling barrel samples each spring before committing to purchases. Chateau maintains similar price structures based on their 1855 classification rankings, despite fluctuations in quality between vintages. The negotiant system functions as it has for centuries, with merchants handling distribution while producers focus on winemaking. Visitors to the region encounter identical sales approaches at different estates, beginning with vineyard tours before progressing to tastings and purchase opportunities. Italian wine producers follow comparable commercial models throughout the country. The Cantina Sociale system allows small growers to pool resources for production and marketing. Wineries in Chianti and Barolo employ similar direct-to-consumer strategies, offering tours that conclude in nearly identical tasting rooms. Online sales platforms use standardized formats regardless of producer size, with identical shipping options and case discounts. Even small family wineries maintain websites following the same basic templates: history page, product listings, and contact forms. Spanish wine businesses operate with remarkable uniformity across regions. Rioja's bodegas employ similar aging classifications that determine pricing tiers. Most maintain nearly identical visitor programs: tours of underground cellars followed by tastings in stone-walled rooms. The larger producers like Marqués de Riscal and López de Heredia use comparable distribution networks, selling through importers in foreign markets while maintaining direct sales at their estates. Smaller wineries cluster into regional associations that handle collective marketing using standardized promotional materials. German wine commerce follows predictable patterns along the Rhine and Mosel rivers. The VDP classification system creates consistent quality hierarchies that influence pricing. Most producers offer similar tasting room experiences, with long wooden bars and flights organized by sweetness levels. Wine clubs operate on nearly identical models throughout the region, with seasonal shipments and member discounts. Even the smallest family wineries use the same label designs: tall, slender bottles with Gothic lettering emphasizing vineyard names and quality categories. Australian wine businesses demonstrate similar standardization. Large producers like Penfolds and Jacobs Creek follow identical national and international distribution models. Their visitor centers offer comparable experiences: self-guided tours ending in expansive tasting rooms with retail sections. Smaller Barossa Valley wineries employ nearly identical direct sales strategies, relying on cellar door traffic and wine club memberships. Pricing follows predictable patterns based on grape variety, region, and production volume regardless of producer size. South American wine industries operate with parallel business structures. Argentina's Mendoza region relies heavily on export markets, with wineries using similar international distributors. Domestic sales follow identical patterns: premium wines sold in major cities, value brands in supermarkets. Chilean producers emphasize foreign markets even more strongly, with nearly all large wineries maintaining identical export-oriented production strategies. Visitor experiences at major estates like Concha y Toro follow scripted routines combining historical narratives with modern winemaking explanations before concluding in similar tasting rooms. The global wine trade functions through standardized financial systems. Letters of credit, shipping contracts, and customs documentation follow identical formats regardless of origin or destination. Insurance products cover standard risks. spoilage, breakage, and temperature fluctuations during transit. Payment terms repeat across markets, typically net 30 or 60 days for commercial buyers. Even small wineries use accounting software specifically designed for the wine industry, tracking inventory and sales in nearly identical ways worldwide. Marketing approaches show remarkable consistency across regions. Social media campaigns emphasize similar visual elements: vineyard landscapes, harvest activities, and cellar operations. Influencers use identical tasting note formats, whether reviewing California Cabernet or French Burgundy. Print advertising follows comparable creative strategies, with bottle shots accompanied by brief tasting descriptions and awards listings. Trade show booths employ similar designs: wood finishes, backlit displays, and tasting counters arranged to maximize traffic flow. Future business trends suggest continued convergence. E-commerce platforms standardize online sales experiences across borders. Blockchain applications promise identical provenance tracking from vineyard to consumer. Direct-to-consumer shipping regulations gradually align between countries. The wine business appears destined for increasing uniformity as global markets integrate further and best practices spread universally. Regional distinctions that once defined commercial approaches continue diminishing as standardized models dominate worldwide. Wine production follows similar patterns in most parts of the world today. In California, the process begins each year with pruning vines in January and February. Workers move systematically through rows of grapes, cutting back last year's growth in preparation for the new season. Large wineries in places like Napa Valley use machines for many tasks, while smaller producers still do some work by hand. The weather remains a constant concern, with growers checking forecasts daily and adjusting their plans accordingly. The buildings used for making wine look much the same everywhere. Large metal tanks stand in rows inside warehouse-like structures. Wooden barrels fill storage areas where the temperature and humidity stay carefully controlled. Tasting rooms typically have long counters where visitors can sample wines, with shelves displaying bottles for sale. Many feature outdoor seating areas with views of vineyards. The designs follow practical needs rather than standing out as unusual or creative. Harvest time brings similar activity across wine regions. Workers pick grapes when tests show the right sugar levels, usually between August and October. The fruit travels quickly to the winery where machines remove stems and crush it. Juice flows into tanks to begin fermentation, a process that happens the same way whether in France, Australia, or South America. Workers monitor temperatures and take samples to check progress at regular intervals. Rules about wine names and labels create uniformity between countries. Certain words like reserve or estate bottled mean specific things that don't change from place to place. Government agencies check that wineries follow these requirements before approving sales. The information on back labels tends to repeat the same details about alcohol content, producer location, and grape varieties. Wine shops organize their selections in predictable ways. Bottles grouped together by country first, then by region within that country. Price tags show cost per bottle clearly, with more expensive wines often kept in separate cases or behind counters. Staff receive training to describe wines using standard terms about fruit flavors, acidity, and body. Customers can expect to find similar selections whether shopping in New York, London, or Tokyo. Restaurants handle wine service nearly identically worldwide. Servers present the bottle, show the label, and open it at the table. They pour small tastes for the person who ordered before filling glasses for everyone. Wine lists follow the same format, starting with sparkling wines, then white, red, and dessert wines. Prices typically mark up bottles 2 or 3 times above retail cost. Wine education programs teach the same information everywhere. Classes begin with how grapes grow, then move to fermentation and aging. Students learn to identify common aromas and flavors using standardized tasting techniques. Exams test knowledge of major regions and grape varieties, with passing scores leading to certificates recognized across the industry. The curriculum changes little from year to year. Trade shows for wine professionals feature similar displays in every location. Booths showcase bottles from different regions, while equipment companies demonstrate the latest tools for vineyards and cellars. Seminars cover familiar topics like marketing trends and new regulations. Attendees exchange business cards and discuss orders for future shipments, following routines established over decades. Wine competitions use judging systems that vary little between events. Samples arrive in identical glasses marked only with numbers. Experts swirl, sniff, and taste each one before assigning scores based on appearance, smell, and flavor. Medals awarded to winners follow the same gold, silver, and bronze categories used in other industries. Results get published in formats that make easy comparisons between vintages and producers. Climate change affects all wine regions in comparable ways. Warmer temperatures cause grapes to ripen earlier than in the past. Drought creates problems for irrigation in places like California and Australia alike. Growers respond by planting different grape varieties or changing trellis systems, solutions that spread quickly between regions facing similar challenges. Research stations share findings that help vineyards adapt to shifting weather patterns. Future developments seem likely to continue these trends toward sameness. New technologies get adopted everywhere at about the same time. Consumer preferences shift in similar directions across different countries. Regulations become more alike as governments coordinate standards. The wine world grows smaller and more uniform with each passing year, leaving little room for unique local traditions to survive unchanged. What began as diverse regional practices has become increasingly standardized on a global scale. Wine consumption habits have become largely similar across different countries and cultures. People typically drink wine in the evening, often with meals, following patterns that vary little between New York, Paris, or Tokyo. Restaurants serve wine in nearly identical glasses, with the bowl shape designed to concentrate aromas. Portion sizes remain consistent, with a standard pour measuring about 5 ounces regardless of location. Most establishments offer wine by the glass in similar selections, usually including one sparkling, a few whites, several reds, and sometimes a dessert wine. The way people shop for wine shows remarkable consistency. Supermarkets arrange bottles by country of origin, then by color: white, red, then rosé. Prices follow predictable ranges, with cheaper wines on lower shelves and more expensive options at eye level or in special displays. Staff recommendations appear on small cards attached to shelves. using familiar descriptions about fruit flavors and food pairings. Liquor stores follow nearly identical layouts, with additional sections for regional specialties or collector items. Home storage of wine follows common practices everywhere. Those who collect wines typically use temperature-controlled units that maintain ideal conditions. More casual drinkers keep bottles in cool, dark places like basements or closets. Serving temperatures have become standardized, with whites chilled and reds at slightly below room temperature. Most people use the same type of corkscrew, with some opting for more expensive lever models, while others choose simple waiter's tools. Wine festivals occur in every major production region with similar formats. Local wineries set up booths where attendees can taste samples. Food vendors offer snacks intended to pair with the wines. Some events include educational seminars or live music, but the basic experience remains the same whether in California, Italy, or Australia. Tickets usually include a souvenir glass and a certain number of tasting tokens, with additional pours available for purchase. Wine clubs operate on nearly identical models worldwide. Members receive regular shipments of selected bottles, typically quarterly. Accompanying materials describe the wines using standard terminology about aromas, flavors, and suggested food matches. Pricing structures follow similar tiers based on quality and exclusivity, with higher levels offering limited production wines or access to special events. Cancellation policies and delivery terms show little variation between different clubs. The role of wine in holidays and celebrations has become uniform across cultures. Champagne toasts mark weddings and New Year's Eve parties in nearly every country that consumes wine. Traditional holiday meals often include specific wine pairings, like red wine with Christmas dinners or sparkling wine with anniversary celebrations. Gift-giving customs involving wine follow similar patterns, with bottle presentation bags and decorative tags available in stores worldwide. Wine tourism follows predictable itineraries in every major region. Visitors start at welcome centers to get maps of local wineries. They proceed to tasting rooms where staff explain the production process before offering samples. Many purchase bottles to take home as souvenirs. Some larger wineries add restaurants or art displays to enhance the experience, but the core activities remain the same. Tour buses follow set routes between popular locations, with schedules that allow similar amounts of time at each stop. Wine's place in popular culture shows consistent themes across nations. Movies and television depict characters drinking wine in similar social contexts. Romantic dinners, business meetings, or relaxing evenings at home. Product placement ensures recognizable labels appear frequently, though the specific brands may vary by country. Celebrity endorsements follow familiar patterns, with famous chefs, actors, or musicians associating themselves with particular wines or regions. Health discussions about wine repeat the same points internationally. Moderate consumption often gets linked to potential heart benefits, while excessive drinking raises concerns about various risks. Government guidelines suggest similar limits for men and women in most countries. Warning labels on bottles vary slightly, but generally convey comparable messages about alcohol's effects. Medical professionals offer nearly identical advice about wine consumption to patients worldwide. The future of wine consumption appears unlikely to change dramatically. Younger generations show similar patterns of wine drinking as their parents, though some prefer different styles or brands. Economic factors influence purchasing decisions in predictable ways across markets. Health trends may shift some preferences toward lower alcohol options, but the fundamental role of wine in social and culinary contexts seems likely to continue along established lines. The globalization of wine culture has created a remarkably uniform set of drinking habits that show little sign of significant divergence in coming years.